Thank you. So I'll ask the first question, and I think for those of us who come out of a union background, and sometimes are even foolhardy and rushing into the fray, we may not truly appreciate how some teachers may feel this really daunting. And so, I could be a teacher for whom this raises all sorts of powerful questions, either because of my own experience or because of the experiences of people in my life that I care a lot about. I could have teenagers sitting in front of me who deal with their discomfort by all sorts of inappropriate comments, and I'm not necessarily I don't necessarily feel completely confident I can handle all that's going to come up. I know that in my class, there are going to be students who have been sexually assaulted, and probably also students who have done the sexual assaulting. And then there are all of these additional questions of people's different sexual identities, and so I'm a teacher, and I'm like, this is overwhelming. So what can we tell teachers that will give them some confidence that there are steps that they can take that actually help address this, without them feel like they're jumping in to the deep end over their head without knowing how to swim?
As my colleague Anthony and I talk about all the time, he reminded me today that the most precious relationship in a classroom is between the educator and the student. And if we are leading with our respect for those students, and allowing them to build their respect for us by being vulnerable sometimes, but certainly by being honest and direct and clear, there are opportunities for us to engage in these conversations. And they certainly can be daunting because there is so much out there to which many of us haven't been exposed. That's real life experience for our students every single day. They communicate in ways that many of us don't really understand. They have entire vocabularies that we have not been exposed to. However, when I open myself up to my students and give them space to open themselves up to me, we can connect on a whole host of issues. And I think that connection allows us to dip our toe in the water, right? We can get the professional learning to build on that, but creating the space where students know they can come to us and talk to us and that we will listen and respect them and get them the support that they need, that's the first step.
I think also, in addition to what Janella said, that was great. We owe it to our students to set them up for success. So I think that we have to have the tough conversations. As soon as somebody sees the topic, they may shut down, but we have a whole generation of young people who have to grow up with this. Growing up, I didn't have a cell phone. They may have been around, but certainly no one from my family had one. And now our young people are dealing with so much more than I know that me or my friends, my sisters, cousins had to deal with. So I think that it's very important that we start just having the conversation, maybe bringing someone who can host a professional development at the school level. But it has to be addressed because this is a very serious issue, and we need to make sure that we're putting forth our best effort and preparing our students for the future.
So there's a bunch of questions here. Let's start with this. Where where are the go-to resources that an educator should go to for guidance here? I mean, this question is about sex ed curriculum, but I think what we're actually talking about here is something far broader than what a sex education teacher would do. It's something that you would infuse in all of your subjects. And so, so I'm a teacher. I want to, arm myself before I jump in. Where should I go to find the materials and resources?
When we started to research this and started to look at what was available just on Google, we found that it was very challenging to get to some quality curricula. We have been pleased to learn that after that, the New York City Department of Education has developed curricula. We know that California became the first state to require developmentally appropriate consent education. And so it does require some action on the educator to get that information. I would say that it's important for us to, putting on our union hats, ask for the kind of professional development we need in our schools, right? And a lot of times there is a sharp focus on the reading and the writing and the arithmetic, but not so sharp a focus on the socio-emotional element of student development. And I think we should be seeking that kind of support from administrators and from our district where it doesn't already exist.
I would just, if I can add, I'm terrified of this microphone. In addition to those resources from New York and California, which are great, SECUS, I know, the Sexuality Education Information Council, they have a website which has a lot of great resources. And if it's relevant in your particular district, Planned Parenthood has a lot of great resources, and there are many communities that are able to use their sexuality education resources as well. And on the professional development front, while I am not an educator, I am a state legislator who was able to benefit from a community in our legislature in the Maryland General Assembly this year. We brought in, for professional development purposes, Tina Chen, formerly from the Obama White House, did a 4-hour sexual harassment training for us, and it profoundly changed the culture of our institution very quickly. Now, that didn't happen for no reason. It happened because we had a lot of newspaper articles about how bad our culture was. But I will say that after that professional development experience for the Maryland General Assembly members and our staff and our interns, we were able to really all feel a lot more comfortable having those awkward conversations that maybe we're not prepared for.
I'd like to reiterate the idea of going to the experts to get trained yourselves first. Now I'm getting feedback. Okay. And that can also be local. A lot of times we think of other educational curriculum, but local rape crisis centers, the Planned Parenthoods, as you mentioned, these experts know how to think about things in developmentally appropriate ways. And if you find that they don't, that they can't translate it, you do. You're the experts on your students. So if you can get the bare bones pieces of the curriculum that are helpful to you, I'll stop there.
This is sort of a segue to a question that Janella, you mentioned professional development. And so there are obviously issues here that those of us who may be a little older are new to us. So what trans kids might be experiencing is certainly an issue that has come to public attention only more recently. So, and given what we know about the phenomena of sexual assault and trans people, we know that they're more likely to have experienced this. So, what sort of things? I'm preparing my list of demands to go in to visit the school district, what sorts of things should I be demanding in terms of professional development?
The point you made about the community-based organizations and the resources that support those who have been victimized, I think that's a really important one, Stephanie, and I would echo that. We have the opportunity to speak with folks who are able to counsel people in the community who have experienced, whether it's abuse or a transition process, and they can help us to think about the reasons why we are reacting the way that we are to our new exposure. One of the most meaningful professional learning opportunities I had was led by a trans counselor who worked for a community-based organization that we brought into the school. And she didn't speak for a while, and I think I would say for the first 2 hours, she didn't speak. She laid low. We were involved in all of these activities, so all of the educators are working on these projects. And after about 2 hours, where we started to really grapple around these issues of sexuality and gender, she spoke to us about what her experience had been. And it was incredibly moving and impactful to all of us, because we really started to think about what that experience is like, not for someone that we've never met before, but what's happening to the students that are in our school, who we all love, right? And we all know well. And if they're grappling with what she's explained she had to experience, and we want to provide that safe space for them. And so I completely agree that the organizations that are available in communities that can expose us to the ways in which we should be thinking differently could be incredibly helpful in our professional growth.
Okay. So this is a question that will be difficult to answer. In a time when schools are so underfunded in this country and often lack the social emotional support students need, how do we address the trauma many students are participating, such as what we would need to do around students facing sexual assault?
That is a tough one. So I know that at my school this year, we have a social emotional learning specialist. Currently, at our school, we have quite a bit of students who experience trauma, and our specialist is always on the go. She does a phenomenal job. So one of the things that we started incorporating this year, is, I mentioned earlier, is like restorative practices. We have a restorative circle. So what we try to do at least 3 times a week is hold this circle, and our specialist may give a prompt over the speaker that she wants us to talk about, and sometimes we're able to just kind of give students the opportunity to just talk about how they're feeling. So in the case something like that would come up, it's our duty to pick up on it and then go. So we also have a social worker in our school, to go to our social worker, school psychologist, the specialist, administration, to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and letting them know what's going on with a particular student. Because sadly, there's instances, within the schools where those things do happen, even in the elementary school level. So we try to be proactive with identifying students who may be going through that and getting them the assistance that they need.
in thinking about our political action, we have to request and lobby for more school social workers, more more trained professionals in our schools who can support our students. And trauma around sexuality is one issue. We also have students who are experiencing suicidal ideation. We have students who are completely overwhelmed by the workload that they have in school. We have students who are struggling in lots of different ways. And in many schools, our social workers are, if we even have one, are stretched, right? They're completely stretched. Our counselors don't have the opportunity to counsel on socio-emotional work because they are doing all of the credit accumulation stuff and making sure students are on track. And then we do have advisory programs and we do have restorative circles in many of our schools. But I do think that one demonstration of the commitment that our system has to our young people would be to invest in more trained professionals who could serve as school social workers.
I know we have a lot of other questions, but I really feel like I need to add something onto this because I could not echo what the educators here are saying more loudly. But I will say in Maryland, we had a discussion exactly about this year. A very important initiative was moving forward that was going to increase educator salaries. I strongly supported it, couldn't wait for it to pass. I'm telling you this story because unlike a lot of other issues, I think in this space, particularly when you're talking about mental health services for students, you can get strong bipartisan support. This is an issue that resonates across the board. So we were moving forward a bill in Maryland, and raising teacher salaries did not have strong bipartisan support. But when it got to the floor, it was actually a Republican that put the amendment on to include raising the salaries for social workers, school counselors, and school psychologists, which was great. Obviously, we wanted to support that. But sometimes finding the money can be the huge challenge. So I was thrilled to see that happen and thrilled that we could include those folks in this legislation. But the other piece of legislation that we've been working on in Maryland, which again, the funding is a huge issue, but we know in Maryland, and I think it's similar across the states, we are nowhere near the best practice recommended ratios for access to student counselors and school psychologists. Even in Montgomery County, we are absolutely nowhere near where we should be.
So, a lot of what we've been talking about what educators would do. But what about the institutions? What about the schools? What about the colleges? What should they be doing? And making the assumption that they won't do something, power concedes nothing without a demand, as Frederick Douglass would say. Making that assumption, what should we be demanding of our schools and colleges to do?
How are we on feedback? What can I do to adjust? Okay, great. I'll speak to the higher ed piece and speak about what we do know in terms of theater of the oppressed. There's interactive theater-based programming There's interactive theater-based programming that supports learning about sexual consent. It's done prior to students' entry into college, like at their pre-enrollment period, which is really helpful because it hits that sweet spot prior to students being at elevated risk for sexual assault. So those kinds of institutional changes to make programming a part of the way they do business is very powerful in terms of training and making things a collective problem. But just to reiterate what's already said, all these have to be professional development opportunities at all levels of staff and faculty. I'll stop there.
I'll add on to that and just talk about the institutions in terms of K through 12. if I can. Earlier we heard about this idea of institutional betrayal, and this is something that I hear about a lot from students in the community. Again, in my local community, we had a pretty high-profile incident of sexual assault on school grounds with a football team, and there was a sense in the community that folks knew this kind of hazing was going on and that administrators were maybe looking the other way. They obviously didn't know necessarily that it was as violent sexual assault as turned out to be allegedly the case. But we have institutions that have been looking the other way for a long time in terms of sexual assault and sexual harassment that's happening inside the schools. And that needs to stop yesterday. I think back again to my own middle school experience, and I remember, a boy, I was in shop class. I was the only girl in shop class, and a boy sort of cornered me and pushed me up against the vise at the work table and starts like thrusting himself into me. And I told the teacher, and the teacher says, boys will be boys. And that was, of course, 1990, but I could see that happening today, and it can't. It can't. And so whether it's through professional development or other ways, we definitely need to make sure that educators and administrators and those who are on boards of education and everybody who is providing oversight for these institutions are taking responsibility so that we don't leave our students feeling betrayed.
Okay, let me end with this question. It's a more general philosophical question, but you also take an opportunity to use it to address any issues that you feel we should have talked about that haven't come up yet. And so we have been talking about the issue of sexual consent and egalitarian relationships in an intersectional way. That it is not simply a question of kind of straight cisgendered men and straight cisgendered women, but that there are all sorts of aspects of it that come to intersect with different sexual identities, with race, with class. And so, the question is, what does this intersexuality that is so central to the Me Too movement, what has that done to our understanding of feminism? I'm just going to pose that general question, but you should also feel free to kind of ruminate, if you will, on the entire discussion we've had today. Maybe we'll just go down, starting with Ariana, down the line.
Okay, in 90 seconds, I'll explain to you the importance of intersectionality and feminism. I will do my very best. So I graduated from high school in 1994, so I came of age in the women's movement in the 90s. Intersectionality was already something that I was learning about as a women's studies student in an undergrad, but it hadn't necessarily trickled out to our mainstream understanding. So it's been a part of my feminist experience my whole life. To me, there's no other way to look at feminism or the women's movement. If you're not looking at how an issue impacts women of color differently, trans women and trans people differently, if you're not looking at how class is related to women's issues, then you're not looking at women's issues. Women are diverse. Men are diverse. When we talk about sexual assault, it is incredibly important and incredibly difficult, but you have to, particularly, I'm in a political context, you can't talk about sexual assault to an African American man without thinking about the legacy on African American men's lives that false claims of sexual assault had. It's impossible to have those conversations without having knowledge and understanding and empathy, and particularly to listen more than you talk. And to me, that's the most important element of intersectionality for all of us, no matter what your personal identity characteristics are. We have to be willing to listen, to be willing to accept that we don't know the answers and we don't know anyone else's experiences. And fundamentally, what we're talking about here in terms of consent in education is really teaching about respect. Intersectionality and feminism is the same thing, right? We don't talk about women's issues without treating everybody with respect and understanding that our experience is not the same as someone else's experience.
I would just build on that to add the importance of thinking about how many other experiences there are that are not what we individually have experienced, right? And respecting that people have different lives that they've lived, there are different experiences out there, has been instrumental in expanding, for many of us, this idea of what equality looks like, how power and control manifest in schools and in workplaces, how race and gender and class all play a role in all of these matters. And it's incredibly hard work, right? It's incredibly hard work when we're thinking about in the K-12 setting, the majority of us are women who are teaching, right? We don't often talk about power and how that plays out for women versus men in K-12. We don't talk about the autonomy that many of us feel we don't have in our classrooms. We don't always talk about our discomfort with this content and trying to figure out how to overcome that so that we can be successful. And with all of that said, I will say that over the last 2 years, as challenging as it has been, we have really grown and connected in ways that I didn't expect possible. These conversations have been difficult. They've been really, really challenging. And we've been interrogating the ways in which we've acted with our students and with ourselves, right? From things that may seem minuscule to us, like using someone's preferred pronoun, that's the world to that person, right? And creating space for people to process what they're overcoming, what they're dealing with, how they are changing is really, really important while we continue to push everyone to that place of respect. So as hard as it's been, I'm glad that we're engaging in this process, and I'm glad that it has been intersectional and that we are considering race-conscious and feminist practice as we are engaging in this work. And I don't expect it to get any easier anytime soon because of the society in which we live, right? Because of the resident in the White House and because of some of the conversations that have been happening on the public scale, we're going to continue to face these challenging conversations. And I think many more of us are willing to engage, and many more of us are willing to have these, to grapple through it and figure out how we come out to a better place on the other side.
I think the underlying theme that I've heard thus far is respect. It is, as I stated earlier, it's just the benchmark. I don't know any other way at this point in my life. I make sure that I give everyone I encounter respect, because in return, what I've found is that the way you approach a person is the way that they will give it back, and that's always worked well for me. And I can only speak, for myself. I don't think we can go back to the days of old. We have to be conscious of the things that we say. We have to make sure and consider how a person is feeling when we're saying it. We can't be insensitive, and I think that when we use that benchmark as being the line, and you consider other people's feelings, and even if you say something that you feel like maybe it was in the wrong context, or maybe it shouldn't have been said, going back to that person and saying, you know what, I apologize. Here's what I meant. I think will be, far better, in the long run for it.
Okay. I would reiterate anything anyone has already said and suggest that we are in an intersectional feminist wave. That is what the feminism du jour is. We don't have any choice well, we always have choices, but I would ask you to cede that point. That this is where we are, and this is the way to move forward. When I talk about this with college students to explain intersectionality, I ask them to think of themselves as whole people and others as whole people. Because sometimes it can be jarring to think about, oh, I'm this and I'm this and I'm this and I'm that, and you're this and that and this. And at the end of the day, people want to be recognized as whole people with all the different parts that are impacting them, be it in privileged or marginalized ways. So that's just one way I would offer as a way to think through intersectionality, and that when it comes to sexual assault, that someone who looks like me can't be the only credible witness to a sexual assault. We all need to be seen as credible human beings who are able to speak of our experiences and what we've witnessed or been victim to.
So I would ask you to join me in thanking our panel who persevered through some technical challenges today to provide us with what I think was a very important and interesting conversation on this subject.